This is We Bleed Orange and Black, the podcast for Halloween and horror lovers. Join us as we interview creators, discuss our favorite folklore, and share original spooky stories. I'm Jeff C. Carter, and this week we're talking with Erik McHatton about his new collection, Straw World and Other Echoes from the Void. Erik McHatton's passion for horror literature began in grade school. It can be credited to an early fascination with the terrific triples horror collections of Hell and Hoke. He began writing fiction seriously in 2019 and has since been published in print and online publications such as Cosmic Horror Monthly, Vestarian, Tales to Terrify, and Lovecraftiana. His story, The Man Who Collected Legati, was chosen to appear in the Legati tribute issue of Cosmic Horror Monthly and was among the stories included in Tenebris Press's Brave New Weird Volume 3, which collected the best new weird horror of 2024. He lives in Kentucky with his beautiful wife and kids, along with dear friends and family, surrounded on all sides. Erik, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
We're going to jump right into the book, but I am confident that between that bio and discussion of your first story, we're going to get a really strong sense of your style and the themes that have preoccupied you with this collection. I'm just going to pick out three of my favorites, and then you can pick out some of your favorites. It's up to you how much you want to give away. We will start at the beginning. Can you talk about how Straw World introduces the flow of the book and the overall thesis?
Well, Straw World is actually, when I first started writing, I wanted to try to pick out something unique to try to bring to horror. Some perception that maybe had been explored before, but not a lot. Because I feel like, all the great horror writers did that. They managed to try to find something that they could bring to the genre that hadn't been brought before. Poe, Lovecraft, Legati. And so I was like, okay, what can I do? I was like, well, I think metatextuality is something that isn't explored quite enough in horror. So I wanted to do that. I wanted to try to attack the reader directly. Rather than and make them, because I honestly feel like I believe that if the universe is infinite, then there are levels and types of reality that we don't consider reality. We consider our own perception of the universe to be what reality is, how that's defined. But that's not necessarily how reality needs to be defined or is possibly defined by other things or other perceptions or perspectives. So I wanted to attack the reader, to tell them, you're complicit in all of this. You're here and you're reading this and you're creating and you're participating in this violence and in this like horror that you're, enjoying. So that was it. That's what I wanted to try to do.
You definitely attack the reader. It is delightfully hostile. I don't think I've read too many stories that not only implicate the reader, but really take it to them, which is an interesting sort of skew on the time-honored tradition of reading, because you are inviting people into your story, and then you're sort of punching them in the back of the head like, how dare you?
Exactly.
This is a larger discussion for another time, but it almost puts a toe into the waters of like trigger warnings or content warnings, because it used to be, hey man, opening this book, you are signing on for whatever happens and you can close the book at any time. And then there's all sorts of push and pull back and forth about the idea of, if you don't like trigger warnings, just ignore them. They're not for you. It doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. But is it somehow incumbent on the author to say, hey, before you sign this contract with your eyeballs and open up the story, these are the things you are agreeing to? Because it brings the agency of the reader into question in a sort of metatextual way.
Right. See, I don't, there was a discussion about this shortly after I got into writing, there was this broader discussion among the horror writing community about trigger warnings and their place and whether or not you should have them in your book at all or where they should be placed in the book. That's why mine are in the back, purely from a spoiler standpoint. I felt like if they're in the front, they could be spoilers so people could accidentally see them. Put them in the back, people will know where to find them. As long as you tell them where they are, you're good. I don't have a problem with them, but at the same time, I kind of feel that way. I kind of feel like, you're bringing a piece of yourself into anything that you read. As soon as you choose to read it, like and stated in the story, like everything that you imagine is comes from something that you've absorbed from the world. In anything you write comes from something you've absorbed from the world. So you're complicit in this act of, you know, reading or writing, or the dance between the reader and the writer. Those things are intertwined, and you can't remove yourself ever completely from your responsibility in this act of creation. And so yeah, I honestly felt like I wanted to make that statement. Yeah, okay, you know, like this story has a pretty, you know, people don't like for pets to die, particularly dogs, I've noticed, because a lot of people have dogs or cats. And there's a pretty nasty section of the story that directly, like, and it's there on purpose. And it's like, you know, this is I wanted people to understand where I was coming from. And this story definitely in a lot of ways says, okay, look, this is who I am. This is who I am as a writer. And this is what I believe. And if you're going to take this ride with me, this story is going to set you up. You're not probably going to be surprised by too much else that comes afterward.
You have a term, mind puppets, for theory of mind simulacrums, or simulacra. Is that the plural of simulacrum?
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
I really like this idea of mind puppets. Play with it throughout the collection. Can you talk a little bit more about how this theory of mind ties into this metafiction?
When I first started reading horror fiction, I started when I was very young, and I started reading very old horror fiction. I started with stuff from the late 1800s, the early 1900s. I was reading stuff for, I think the cutoff was probably, you know, the 70s. It was probably as much, because I started reading these collections from Helen Hoke, and she died in 1990, and she'd been collecting things since the 50s. So that's what horror was to me, you know, horror literature was to me. And then when I started, when I picked up writing, I realized, okay, I have to read stuff that's contemporary. So I was like, who's the best contemporary horror writers of the last like 20 years or 30 years? Tell me what I need to read. So I started reading that, and that's when I discovered Ligotti. And Ligotti's idea of, you know, the universe being manipulated, and we're all just basically these meat puppets that are being driven by some force that's behind everything else, that's manipulating us and our existence. That's where I got the idea, the puppetry idea. So it's not super original, but then I started thinking about how, you know, when you read, you're creating these characters in your own mind, and you're kind of like puppeteering them in your head, and then they become like these creations like we are. So then I was like, well, how can I use that? And then it got even nastier, because it was just like, well, what if I force the reader or manipulate the reader into not only creating puppets in their mind to destroy and mutilate, but then make them put, you know, their own family members into it. And then now they've not only killed something, they've killed something that's dear to them, and it's in there forever. And so I thought that was an interesting idea for horror, you know, because I'd never seen anybody do that before.
I could definitely see why your editor, TJ, was on board for this experiment.
Yeah.
He loves the metafiction.
Mm-hmm. He sure does.
In Straw World, which is the first story in your collection, Straw World, the narrator takes the reader on a tour of this theme park, but the layout of Straw World is also reflected in the layout of the book. Can you talk a bit about the houses and the thematic shifts that each house represents?
I mean, I worked together with him, but for the most part, TJ was the one that did that layout. The first thing I turned into him, actually, the way I had put the TOC together was, I have a lot of flash fiction that I had just sitting around, and so I had like it was 10 stories, like short stories, and then 10 pieces of flash fiction in between each story, kind of like to lead one into the other. And he was like, I think, you know, that's going to mess with the reader. They're not going to like, you know, going, you know, maybe that'll mess up the flow of the book or whatever. So we talked about it, and he was like, well, why don't we, he's like, this story really kind of is like a thesis statement for your broader fiction. He's like, so why don't we use that and structure it that way? So he's like, we'll just, you know, we'll take the ones, and he tried to group them thematically. And I think he did a pretty good job. You know, I when I look at it, I can see, you know, each one, but that was kind of all him. He just he found similarities in theme, and he grouped them like that. And I always wanted to close the collection with the last story. There was never not going to be the case. So he decided to like bridge the first and last story, which do share a common theme, and then like try to make a pathway for the reader through it. And I think he did a really good job, but I can't take a whole lot of credit for that one.
this is going to seem unrelated or trivial, but I have a very strange relation to comic books because the first comic books that I collected were the handbooks of the Marvel Universe, which was just like an encyclopedia of all the characters and their items, their stats, their biographies that affected the way I read comic books. You know, I read them as encyclopedias first. Do you think that reading those collections in the beginning gave you that metafiction outlook because you were looking broadly at whole decades and you were catching up on the arc of horror from the 1920s up until the 70s?
Yeah, I really do feel like that's definitely the case. You know, because I got to watch how horror like evolved. It wasn't until I was in high school that I actually picked up anything that was viewed termed contemporary. It was Stephen King. That's another thing that one of my favorite short story writers is Robert Bloch, and one of the reasons I respect him so much as a writer is that he started out, you know, as an acolyte of Lovecraft at a young age. I think he's in his teens, and then he wrote in that style, and then he kind of like moved away from it when Lovecraft died. He took this long break, and he just kind of shifted his style. And that's one of the things I tried to do, was try to, like, every time I write a story, can I find a different way to tell it than I'd have before? So, because I wanted to pay homage to that. And as far as metafiction is concerned, yeah, I think that there's so much, you know, it's like even in Lovecraft's writing, which is largely plot driven, even though people, you know, tend to believe that he wrote meandering stories or whatever because his reputation. I'm not a huge, you know, like Lovecraft's not really super influential to me. I like some of his stories. Clark Ashton Smith was probably far more influential as far as that's concerned. But no, he did the same thing. He wanted to, you know, he talks directly to the reader sometimes. The beginning of Call of Cthulhu is very much telling the reader, like, look, your understanding of things is wrong. And, you know, the more you discover about something, the more harmful it's going to be, and the more crazy it's going to make you. You might want to just remain in ignorance. And so that always fascinated me, the relationship of trying to change the reader's mind about the world around them, not just entertain them, but to have them walk away from a story with a different perspective. So, yeah, definitely. And I watched how different writers attempted to do that. There's a story that was written within the last few years by Cody Goodfellow called "The Man Who Escaped the Story." That's incredible in that, in its ability to do just that, to make the reader walk away going, "Wow, that's how do I feel about my own existence now?"
I feel like Lovecraft birthed the genre or the sort of philosophy of cosmic horror, which we're still grappling with and probably should always be grappling with. And then Philip K. Dick came along and just completely rewrote the landscape of pop cultural fiction.
Mm-hmm.
And everything after Dick is Dickian.
Yeah, I really, that's one of my big blind spots, because I always group Dick in with more science fiction than I do with horror. And I focus largely on horror, but I've read a few of his short stories. And yeah, I'd have to agree, that man's perspective on everything was super unique.
But I mean, that was the thing that got brought over into all of our other forms of media. Everything became Philip K. Dick colored after that. And as our real life began to become more of a sci-fi horror slow motion dystopia, it's all Philip K. Dick all the way down. And I'm curious about metafiction because with the advent of social media and shorter news cycles and the democratization of the written word in forms of blogs and now Substacks and things like that, there's always a conversation about the conversation, about the conversation, about the piece. Like, but before a movie comes out or a book comes out, people are already spinning up in these little flywheels of reactions and conversations and biases and echo chambers. And it is very metafictional.
Yeah, one of the things that fascinates me is I heard a quote is that we are the universe experiencing itself. And one of the things that I've sat around, because I'm a stay-at-home dad, I've been sitting in my house, like just sitting around thinking for a really long time, and I think about stuff like that, like that what you just said. And I really feel like that's what we're doing. Like that's the point of our existence. I think that taking things and discussing them endlessly and picking them apart and to understand what they are and how they work is kind of our purpose, as because I believe that every human being is a individual node of a burgeoning superconsciousness, and throughout history, that's what we've tried to do, is to get together into larger and larger groups, in order to share information more efficiently. And we've managed to do that now with the internet. And then people can't help themselves. They have to, not everyone, obviously, but I mean, look at the early 2000s internet with like stuff like Ain't It Cool News, where everybody has to understand every little thing. They follow a movie like from production all the way through to the first trailer. When the movie comes out, they just constantly have to be discussing things and picking them apart and understanding them. That's how it is interesting to me that that's how society has evolved, to where it's like you can't not have an opinion on something, and if you don't have it, sometimes people look at you like you're crazy. Like, well, what do you think about this? I don't really know. I don't have much of an opinion. I don't know enough about it. Really? You don't have an opinion? It's like, yeah, I don't. I don't know enough about this to even really have an opinion on it. Maybe if I were to look into it, I might. But you're right. Like today, everybody just thinks that you just have to endlessly discuss things. And maybe that's just us fulfilling our purpose.
I hope not. I mean, I absolutely see where you're coming from with all these stories, with your thesis statement, and even with this idea of exponentially connected nodes in an emergent superconsciousness. But I suspect that humans in a very, very small group, I always sort of bring it back to the longhouse. I think humans are evolved to live in a longhouse in a small communal group. You look at Dunbar's number, we can only hold so many mind puppets in our head, so many interfamilial and outer tribal relationships in our mind. And once you surpass that, it does get more theoretical. It does get into more of a pure information. You're not experiencing these people and living with them and hearing them snoring at night. They're just others. They're outsiders. And then you start to use symbols to group them into different categories. I don't think that's necessarily a good thing, and I don't think we've really evolved for it. I think it is really just a blip recently that has to do with denser populations, more interconnectivity, exponential population growth, and things like that.
Oh, I hope I'm wrong.
Yeah.
I really do. I agree with you 100%. I think people work a whole lot better. And I've seen this in smaller groups. Yeah, absolutely. There's more humanity. There's more understanding. There's more empathy when you put people in smaller groups versus larger groups. So it's easier. And we can definitely see that with the way things are going in our country today, how it's so easy for people to say, it doesn't matter. It's not happening to me. And so, yeah, I hope I'm wrong. I really, really do. Because it is scary. It is, and it's isolating. It really is. It makes you less than human, I believe. And I don't want to be that. So I hope I'm wrong.
And to bring this back into the fiction, imagine the joy of just sitting down and reading a story for yourself and not having to cling to any preconceived notions or biases or defend it to someone or talk about authorial intent and is this moving the genre forward or back?
Yeah, authorial intent I'm not a big fan of it. Like if someone asks me what I meant by something, I'll tell them. But I also would like for them to understand that authorial intent is only a small part of what goes into creating a story. Like you don't even know what's in there, and until sometimes somebody will read something I wrote and they'll tell me about something that's in there that I didn't intend, but it's there, and I'm like, you're right, that's true. I put it in there not knowing I was putting it in there. So I'm not a huge fan of that type of analysis. I don't like people to say, well, the author meant this. I was like, well, I'm sure he did, but he accidentally did this other stuff too. And you can't discount it just because he didn't mean it. So, yeah, I agree.
You also can't know unless you have a really crystal clear mind puppet of them. You can't really know what they unintentionally put into the story. But
absolutely.
Back to the collection. That's the danger of discussing these ideas, is that they just ping pong. I claimed the first story, which was Straw World. Why don't you pick one out that you want to chat about?
I guess I'd like to talk about The Man Who Collected Legati.
All right.
And the reason I want to talk about it is because I mentioned Robert Bloch earlier. And the reason I wrote the story was because I am a fan of Thomas Ligotti, excuse me. And Bloch wrote a story called The Man Who Collected Poe. I don't know if you ever heard of it or aware of it, but he decided that he wanted to write a story in the style of Edgar Allan Poe. And it was going to be about a man who did just that. He was the world's foremost collector of Poe. And Bloch had a relationship with Lovecraft. So the way he decided to attack the story was he wanted to write, like a Poe-like story that was about that. And then because it's two men meet at a bibliophile convention. And he tells him, you like Poe? I've got this huge collection. Come back to my house to see it. And things just get stranger and stranger. And eventually a little bit Lovecraftian toward the end until it ends fantastically with a Poe-like ending. Love that story. And it spawned what is a small literary tradition. And it's a very tiny one, but there are several stories that have been written over the decades since this story was written that are The Man Who Collected Lovecraft, The Man Who Collected Bloch. Kim Newman wrote a story that was collected in Best Horror of the Year in the 80s, one of those volumes. That was The Man Who Collected Barker. Mark Samuels wrote The Man Who Collected Machen. So I realized that had happened, and I'm like, I love Ligotti. I'm going to take a shot at it. And it's pretty, I mean, I know that it's kind of like arrogant a little bit to say, okay, I'm going to write a story that sounds like Ligotti, who I think is an incredible writer. But I was like, I'm going to try. So I sat down and I went out and I bought every instance of this like type of story I could find so I could study them to find out what they were. I poured over Ligotti's writing so I could try to isolate like the different styles over the years and try to like put them in. And then figure out how he might put the story together so that I could, and then also have a metafictional narrative as well, all coming together at the end. And I think I mostly pulled it off. It's done pretty well, but I love the idea of participating in something that has come before me, paying tribute to a couple of different writers that I love and challenging myself to try to see if I pulled it off or could pull it off.
It's not only a very bold experiment, but it's so cool that there is that sub genre of these stories that tackle another writer's voice and style and body of work.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting that somebody would challenge themselves like that to say, okay, I'm going to write like Edgar Allan Poe and see if I can do it. And he did. And that's what, and I will admit that mimicry isn't, I mean, it's a gift, but it's not, it's a lot easier to mimic somebody than to have it. A lot of people do that. When they start out writing, they're going to sound like other writers. I try to get my pastiches out of the way. Like if I'm going to write a pastiche, like there's another story in this collection that's definitely a pastiche, but it's supposed to be. Mm-hmm. It's built specifically to do that, and that's what this was. It's like if I'm going to write Ligotti pastiche, I'm going to write the Ligotti pastiche. So let's do it.
Don't just borrow lightly, but actually make that part of the story.
Absolutely, just steal whole cloth and then give yourself an excuse to have done it. So yeah, that was definitely the reason.
My next pick from the collection is going to be On the Night Bus. Can you set this one up?
I wanted to write a story that felt like a panic attack because I had a problem a few years back. I started having panic attacks, not often, but pretty bad ones. And, it's a pretty unique feeling. And this type of, I'd never had an issue with anxiety before, but I was starting to have one. And, I was like, it's such an interesting, unique type of fear that I'd never experienced before. So I want to try to tackle that. And as far as prose style is concerned, I started out pretty flowery, pretty, trying to mimic these old authors that I'd read and who I consider my mentor, Carson Winter, was like, writing's not like that. You're going to alienate your audience maybe a little bit, maybe try to figure out how to write in a more contemporary style, So he gave me some examples of that, people to check out. One of them was Brian Evanson. So I was like, okay, so how do I join my style with this more simple type of prose? And then do something like that. So that's where that story came from. I want to write a story that feels like a panic attack, and I want to write it in a more simple way to try to challenge myself to attack a story in a way that I'd never done before. And I always thought I love first person fiction, but so often first person fiction, there's no explanation as to who the writer is the writer is talking to. They're talking, but who are they speaking to? I was like, okay, it's gonna be a journal. He's writing to a doctor that's treating him for this anxiety. So that way it makes sense. And it also allows me to structure the story. There's this one part of it that I laugh every time I've gone through the story. I laugh every single time of it because he's constantly telling himself, things are going to be okay. He's calming himself down or whatever. Things are going to be fine or whatever. And then there's a break in the story where he's like, I'm sure everything's going to be okay. And the next sentence is like, things have gotten really out of hand. And it's, and I think that's funny every single time because it's just like what has happened in between the last time he decided to write something down and now. But yeah, it was just I wanted to attack anxiety. That's something I was experiencing, try to make the reader feel that type of anxiety and bring that feeling up in the reader, that type of fear, and write in a more simple type of prose.
It's a really cool story because I think first person can be overused, or sometimes it's so simple and direct that it doesn't have a lot of flair or interest to it. But the fact that this is epistolary and first person, and we know that there is a motivation behind it. This is a patient writing to their doctor, and the way that they keep it together is by writing what they're feeling and thinking and constantly tamping down the feelings that arise. There is a form of cognitive behavioral therapy, which is grounding, constantly paying attention to details and physical things around you so that you don't get cast adrift in your own mind and spinning with your emotions. But the journal is a great device for this because you're grounding the character, you're explaining the setting and the mindset, but these little details really ground you in the situation. And by pointing out, oh, this is normal, this is nothing to worry about. I've noticed this. Okay, I'm not going to let it throw me. There's probably an explanation for all of this. Sure, there could be 100 disastrous reasons why the bus is late, or why there's a new driver, or why my other passengers aren't here, or why these other people are crowding onto the bus, or why we're blowing past these stop signs. All the different levels work with each other to amplify the bubbling dread. It's very effective.
And I also love the idea that you're trapped within this one character's perceptions of things. So you can't argue with them. And I wanted to, one of the things that was important to me was I wanted to put just enough into the story to where you can't discount what they're saying. Like it's one thing for the reader to understand that they're blowing things out of proportion, that they're and they may be, but I don't want the reader to be able to definitely say that at any point. So every once in a while I would sprinkle in a detail that's different. So that's so weird. It's just like he talks about the city changing over and everybody has to assume these roles in the city. And you're like, what the hell? So maybe he's right. Like, you don't even know what that, because the reader has nothing to grasp onto, nothing to no touchstone where they can say, okay, well, this is what reality is. And he's wrong. So, yeah. And I really like trapping the reader inside of his head and then forcing him to go along this ride.
Yeah, definitely a highlight in the collection for me.
I'm glad to hear that. Carson, I think that's one of Carson's favorites as well.
The last story I want to single out is one that is perfect for We Bleed Orange and Black, and that is Timmy Thomerson's Turn. Tell us about that one because, loved it. Absolutely loved it.
I joined this group on Reddit that was doing like a writing competition. You sign up for it. It was like in a small Discord group. And then every week there was a theme. There was another story in this that was in the collection that was written for that too. And the first week I wrote this one story, and then I won. So I got to pick. I got my pick for the next like prompt, and it was holidays. So I'm like, I'm a horror writer. I'm going to pick Halloween. So I picked Halloween. I love Halloween. It's my favorite holiday, non-surprising, I suppose. So, but what I wanted to do was I wanted to go back to my childhood and what Halloween was like when I was a kid. And I grew up in the 80s. And so, and that's when I fell in love with horror. And I think my favorite decade for horror cinema and television is the 1980s. So this story is a love letter to that era. Going trick-or-treating with your friends. I grew up poor in a poor neighborhood, so my main characters were poor. Every proper name, with the exception of one in the story, is either a horror director, a horror actor, or somebody, a makeup artist, or something from that. Like Cassie Peterson, it's Cassandra Peterson, it's Elvira. Tim Thomerson was a doll man. all I've got it all in there. I've got one of the streets is Henenlotter, who make basket case, things like that. The only one that's not is the rich neighborhood, which was Shermer Oaks, which I took from John Hughes. Yeah, John Hughes. Shermer Oaks was taken from Shermer, Illinois, which was where he set a lot of his movies, a fictional town, and that was it. And so, yeah, I love that story. I just wanted to write a simple ghost story, but I wanted to twist it in a way that I'd never seen ghost stories done before. Because ghosts are always, if they're haunting you, they can, sometimes they can change reality or whatever. But I wanted my ghost to be powerful and to just basically just be a story of revenge. It was really bleak, and nobody, one of the things that always bothers me about horror is like the people just don't like killing kids in horror, and I think that's not fair. Kids go through things. Kids get abducted and tortured, and bad things happen to children all the time, and we don't discuss it. Why don't their stories get told? So I was like, I'm just going to be as vicious as I possibly can and kill a bunch of kids and see if I can't do it in an entertaining way. I love that story.
Getting Lovecraftian with it really does allow your, I'd say antagonist, but I don't know if it's a antagonist or protagonist, but it allows Timmy to really flex their power and twist the world around his victims. And you could say this is revenge. You could say this is justified or not. I'll let you read the story and decide. The idea of endless Halloween as a nightmare is always so great. And there's an episode of Goosebumps that we covered on the show, Attack of the Jack-o'-lanterns, where these characters drag these kids out trick-or-treating and like, oh, we know of a better place. And every house they go to is just giving them pounds and pounds of candy. And these kids are propelled forward and they have to keep trick-or-treating way past the point where they've had too much of a good thing. And that just keeps going and it keeps devolving. And I think your story is a great companion piece to that episode.
That's exactly what I was going for. Like this idea that you could turn the holiday into something that would be almost like eating too much candy. It makes you sick, too much of a good thing. And that was the idea, and that's how I attacked it. Like in Endless Halloween, you nailed it. That's exactly what I was going for.
Eric, what are you working on next?
Still doing shorts, still trying to pump those out. I'm a slow writer. I'm like a George R. R. Martin type writer. So, still trying to do that. I'm starting to also outline a novel. I've got my collection coming out. So I think next should be long form fiction. So I'm either that a novella or a novel. I'm not sure which, but I'm bouncing those ideas around, and that's about it.
Is there a pre-order link for this collection?
Yeah, right now you can order. The pre-order should be up on Amazon, but if you want to go to undertakerbooks.com in the shop section, you can find the book there. If you order, you can order an ebook there to pre-order both ebook and paperback. If you get a paperback, you automatically get an ebook to go with it.
Awesome. I will include a link in the show notes. Where can our listeners find you online?
I'm Erik McHatton on pretty much ERIK McHatton on all social media, Facebook, Instagram, Blue Sky. If you search my name, you're going to find. I'm the only Erik with a K McHatton in the world, I think.
Must be nice. That's good SEO. Yeah. Eric, thanks for hanging out with us.
Thanks a lot, man. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening. Please subscribe and follow. We're now on YouTube. Links are in the show notes. You find me at jeffccarter.com and hit the link to pick up my collection, We Bleed Orange and Black, 31 fun-sized tales for Halloween. Until next time, stay spooktacular.